welcome everybody, and thank you for coming out this evening. We are very happy to have you all here at this event. My name is Heather Crislip, and I'm President and CEO of Housing Opportunities Made Equal, or HOME of Virginia. We were thrilled to partner with the Library of Virginia to host the Mapping Inequality exhibit in Richmond, which will be on display here all summer. I hope you had a chance to glance at some of the maps and descriptions that are out in the foyer. And if not, that you'll be able to browse them after the session, when we'll also have refreshments available, and hopefully Brian and others available to answer any questions that you have. The exhibit will run through the summer. We hope that it will conjure up questions like, how do we create institutions and policies that promote opportunity and equality? How can we foster greater opportunity in neighborhoods that have been chronically disinvested in? And finally, how do we overcome the racism and distrust that many of these housing policies were built upon? I'm very happy to turn this conversation over to three very thoughtful and impressive people. Mr. Brian Koziol holds a master's degree in urban and regional planning from VCU and envisioned and produced the maps that you'll find in the exhibit and that we'll be discussing this evening, in addition to the Opportunity Map project, which he'll also talk about. Brian is the Director of Research at Housing Opportunities Made Equal, where he does work to help municipalities conduct fair housing planning, as well as contributes to research elements to help pose enforcement actions under the Fair Housing Act. Dr. John Moeser probably doesn't need to be introduced to most of you. Dr. Moeser has been instrumental in Richmond's honest discussions about our history, race, and poverty. His Unpacking the Census series and the Maggie Walker Anti-Poverty Initiative are only among the most recent examples. Dr. Moeser is Professor Emeritus of Urban Planning from Virginia Commonwealth University and is a Senior Fellow at the Bonner Center for Civic Engagement at the University of Richmond. And most notably to me, he's a longtime board member at Housing Opportunities Made Equal. Dr. Gregg Kimball is the Director of Educational and Outreach Services at the Library of Virginia. He holds a PhD in history from the University of Virginia and has been very involved with the 150th anniversary of the Civil War and Emancipation. He's the author of American City, Southern Place, A Cultural History of Antebellum Richmond, and I understand he's a fabulous musician. I'm also honored to introduce tonight, I have Dr. Velma Ballard, who is the chair of the board for Housing Opportunities. I'm going to let you all know she's here. We're very grateful for the assistance and support of the Library of Virginia with this project. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Brian, who's going to talk first about the Opportunity Map.
Sure. Thank all of you all for coming this evening. The concept of the Opportunity Map was something that I actually walked into the first day of my job. It had been sitting there for several months. My predecessor had kind of worked up the methodology and worked up this draft report, Will Sanford, and I let it sit there for a couple months before I was comfortable enough to pick it up. But it came out of this desire to take a look at where we stand today in our region, and John and Greg are going to talk about the forces that shaped opportunity as we see it today. But it's, mapping opportunity is this very illusory concept, and mapping it is a pretty difficult thing to do, because how do you map this a chance for a better life? And so what we did was we took 22 relatively easy to get at socioeconomic indicators spread over education, wealth, access to transportation, all of those things that lie at the center of opportunity. And it's all kind of based on the opportunity cycle. And really simply, the opportunity cycle is, we can start anywhere, but let's just say education. So we know that the better educated we are, the greater the chance of us going on and getting a job that we like and that pays well. And with that job, we earn more. We know that people that earn more are more likely to purchase a home. And then we know that neighborhoods that have high levels of home ownership appreciate in value more quickly than neighborhoods that have lower home ownership levels. And since home ownership is traditionally the primary way that we build and accumulate wealth in this country and pass it on, it's a really important factor. And so higher neighborhoods that have higher levels of home ownership rates, you have greater levels of wealth to pass on to your children so that they can then go to college, get a master's degree, get the job of their dreams, and repeat the cycle. And so what we see, though, is that in the inner city, and this is the city of Richmond boundary here. It's the fan. We're like right here, give or take. Henrico, Chesterfield. This kind of validates what a lot of us already know, is that the inner city, particularly the East End, the South Side, doesn't have a whole lot of opportunity. So we have these forces that over time have created these neighborhoods that make it incredibly hard for the people that live there to access those opportunity factors like quality education, quality jobs that pay a living wage. And then you factor in transportation issues, spatial mismatch between jobs and skill levels, and it becomes even more severe. And so we've really got this, we've got kind of two opposing cycles. This wealth generating cycle in the suburbs, where a lot of the growth and money has gone over the past 50 years, and then this inner city cycle of poverty, in which it becomes increasingly more difficult to escape. The one thing that we did not look at when we created the opportunity map was race. But if we go to the next map, this is the city of Richmond by race and ethnicity, by concentrations, by census blocks in 2010. Red is your white population, blue is African American, some purple concentrations of Asian population, and then Latino, Hispanic is green. So you can see that we live in a highly segregated, racially and ethnically segregated city. But if you overlay this map on top of that opportunity map, we live in a highly segregated community by access to opportunity. And so these two gentlemen are going to talk about the forces that got us here, and with the hope being that understanding that, one, we won't repeat history, but that somewhere in that history lies the key to move forward. And so with that,
yeah. I might just quickly mention too that we also launched this website, and what we did, we decided when we partnered with Home to have the exhibit, to add some historical maps that would fill out, just as Brian said, how we got here. So we'll be taking you back through some maps that aren't in the original Home show that also reveal, I think, a lot of the patterns and how they came about over time.
It's really a pleasure to be on this panel with Brian and Gregg. I've admired Gregg's scholarship for many, many years, and Brian's work at Home with this opportunity mapping is really cutting-edge technology, number one, and makes so abundantly clear just how divided our community is. And I like Gregg's idea when we got together to talk about the format tonight, that instead of starting with the past and going to the present, that we would start with the present. And Brian has given us, I think, a very good overview of the divisions within our city, and then go back. I suppose the question that I would raise at the very outset, certainly following Brian's presentation, is today, 2014, is there more opportunity now than in the past? Well, the pat answer would be yes, there is more opportunity. And one can look at major civil rights legislation. We now have fair housing laws. We now have equal opportunity laws. We have, at least by law, open access to public schools. But whatever happened to Jim Crow? Well, Jim Crow never left, really. Jim Crow took on a different life. He went to college and then on to graduate school, got his MBA and his law degree. And later on, Jim Crow became a very successful businessman and actually was elected to the Richmond City Council, where he amassed a good chunk of power. And so it's interesting how he was able to continue his work, though in a way that perhaps was not as stark and as lethal as might have been the case in the past. For one thing, we're more racially segregated now than we were in the 19th century. A lot of people just find that hard to believe, but Gregg will confirm that. We are more divided by income in the 21st century than we were in the 20th century. And meanwhile, there are greater distances, literally, the separation by miles between wealth and poverty is greater than any time in Richmond's history. What I'd like to do very quickly is just kind of highlight some of the events that took place in the 20th century that led to what we have today. A city that is very divided. There's lots of opportunity for many, but there is lots of anguish for a lot of other people. In fact, just one little factoid. When Brian was talking about the unevenness in opportunity, and he made these excellent, clear maps. Shortly afterwards, I think it was in January of this year, that the Department of Health, the Virginia Department of Health, specifically the Office of Minority Health, issued a report. And they looked at the whole state of Virginia. But they also had GIS maps, and they looked at the Richmond metropolitan area. But to put the lack of opportunity in really stark terms, there can be as much as a 20-year difference in life expectancy between those who live in these high poverty parts of East Richmond and those who live in the same city, West End Richmond. And incidentally, a little factoid, and that is of all of the census tracts in central Virginia, that includes the city of Richmond and 8 localities. The single wealthiest census tract used to be the tract in Henrico County from the Country Club to Goochland and from River Road to the James River. but it now is Windsor Farms. And the single poorest tract is Gilpin Court. And yet the distance, you know, is only about 3 miles. It's really quite incredible. But what I am going to be pointing out tonight, though, is that while that is very graphic, essentially when you look at the difference between wealth and poverty, the distances separating the two are really immense, by miles and miles away, the separation. You particularly see this in the counties, Chesterfield County and Enrico County. Very quickly, though, when you look at what shaped what we have today, you can, I know that one of the maps up here is, let's see, Sandra, we might go to the what I call the bullseye map. This one, let's see, this one right here. I just call this the bullseye map in that the red area represents high poverty census tracts. And what's very interesting is that the red areas essentially are bordered on the west by Chamberlain Avenue. It's a very distinct boundary. And I was just talking to Brian last night. We were in Genner Park at a meeting, and this subject came up. And Chamberlain Avenue is really quite a stark boundary line, particularly on the north side of the river. On the south side of the river, high-density poverty is on both sides of what is known as Route 1, or the old Jeff Davis Highway. Now, how did this come to be? Well, what is really tragic about particularly our 20th century history is that it was designed to be that way. It was not by accident. It was the result of very purposeful action. And just very quickly, to kind of give you a summation, it was not until the 20th century that Richmond adopted by law a racial zoning code. It was in the first decade. It was not that long that the U.S. Supreme Court declared it unconstitutional. But then Richmond did it again, this time in the late 1920s. They couldn't have race-based zoning anymore because of Supreme Court edict. But this time what they did was to link the continuation of racial segregation to the state of Virginia's brand new Racial Purity Act. And the history of that alone is really startling. But the Racial Purity Act is the legislation that made illegal a white person marrying a black person. And so taking that act then, what the City Council of Richmond did is to say by code that no one could live in a neighborhood whose residents they could not marry. So they didn't state explicitly blacks had to live here, whites had to live there, but the effect was just the same. And within 1 year, the U.S. Supreme Court declared that unconstitutional. And then as you move into the late 30s, you then get to the map in the upper left-hand corner. In the latter part of the New Deal, the Homeowners Loan Corporation, which was designed to forestall the housing foreclosure crisis of the Great Depression, used local real estate appraisers and lenders to grade and evaluate neighborhoods. And this was done all across the United States. A former student of mine, Michael Sarahan, got these documents from the U.S. Archives, brought them home, and all of the neighborhoods in Richmond were evaluated. And they were actually color-coded. The first grade neighborhoods were designated A, and they were colored green. and then the blue colored neighborhoods were grade B, the yellow were C graded, and then all of the neighborhoods colored red were considered the worst neighborhoods. Now what's interesting about this color coding is that those who did this work, these were all Richmonders who actually did the evaluation, they were to talk about income levels, they were to talk about housing values, they were to talk about the conditions within the neighborhood, they were to talk about professions or occupations, I should say, of the residents, and just a whole array of factors. And they did. They did that for grades A, B, and C. They did none of that for grade D neighborhoods. They were all black. And Jackson Ward, despite its strong economic base, was declared D and colored red. Now what that does is to set up the city for areas where later private mortgage companies, lenders decide to make investments. And since those are bad neighborhoods, they become prime suspects for what happens in the 1950s and the 1960s, actually into the early 1970s. Highway building, slum clearance, urban renewal. Our city hall was built, the Coliseum was built, even the federal building was built in an area that used to be one of the strongest black neighborhoods in the city. Navy Hill no longer exists. And the result of all of that was that blacks who lost their homes, those who were middle income professional blacks, began to move into adjoining white neighborhoods. That led then to a white outmigration, and they could move thanks to FHA, but FHA was so discriminatory that black families, credit-worthy black families, could not get FHA financing. FHA was as racist as it could be. The Underwriter's Manual, in fact, a wonderful book to read is a book by Charles Abrams entitled Forbidden Neighbors. So then, poor blacks who were displaced moved to East End. And why do they go to East End? Because by the 1950s, most of the public housing has already been sited in East End. So you've got Gilpin Court, which was the first, and it fronted Chamberlain Avenue. That was built in the early 40s. And then in the 60s, you had 4 other public housing communities. And so what happens, the densities of race-based poverty begin to mushroom. And so what we have today is the result of what we did in the 20th century. And now, as I said, the distance separating wealth and poverty are greater than ever. If you go out in Chesterfield County, thanks to the circumferential highways we have, there are miles and miles of separation between high wealth neighborhoods in Chesterfield and really very poor neighborhoods in Chesterfield. And the same thing is true of Enrico County. But what Gregg is going to do is then talk about the 19th century. What was the 19th century like, Gregg?
Well, I'm going to start by, again, reverse engineering our story here a little, going backwards. And some of you may know the work of the historian C. Van Woodward, which now is quite a while ago that he wrote his Strange Career of Jim Crow. But it was one of the seminal books when I was coming up. And the reason he wrote that book is he had been working with people like Thurgood Marshall, looking at the history of segregation. And one of his key arguments was that even though Southerners loved to say that segregation was an ingrained folkway that couldn't possibly be overturned, C. Van Woodward said, no, you invented segregation in about 1900. And he was right. Cities before that period, to some large extent, were not segregated by race the way we would normally think of it. So let's go back to the very first map, the earliest map, which is the 1856 Ellison map of the city. This was a map that was actually included in the Ellison city directory. So if you bought your city directory and you were a stranger to Richmond, you would have this big fold-out map that would come out with your directory. Now if we take a look on the far left of the map and look at the legend for it, And again, you could go online and check this out. One thing you'll notice in this list of institutions, and we were talking earlier that one of the problems of this period in terms of talking about neighborhoods is we don't have these fancy census tracts to work with. There's really no way with like the 1850 or 60 census before the Civil War to break down who was living where to any precision. So we had to do a little bit of guessing and read a lot of secondary literature of the time to get a sense of where people were in the city. One thing you might notice in this list is there are a number of German institutions, and many of them are in that neighborhood that John just mentioned of Navy Hill. That area was actually a fairly mixed race neighborhood. Free blacks lived there, enslaved people lived there, working men and immigrants worked there. I should also mention that in 1860, and this is something now we're just coming full circle to, there were about 13% of Richmonders were foreign-born, which is historically the peak of foreign-born population. Most of them Europeans, Irish, German, from Great Britain. People worked at places like the Tredegar Ironworks. The other thing to remember about this city is that it's incredibly small. One of the other maps that's on the website essentially shows the annexation history of Richmond, where it goes from this little postage stamp to the city kind of frozen at 1970 because of I'm sure some events that you all know very, very well. And at this point, the city was only about as big as to Belvedere Street on the west and about the base of Church Hill on the east. And Bacon's Quarter Branch on the north, so it was actually fairly compact, and that's why we call it a walking city. There were no public transportation to speak of, so people had to live and work closely to where they worked. They had to live there, just like the ironworkers who lived on Oregon Hill would walk down the hill to Tredegar, which meant you had racially integrated neighborhoods. Now, how could you have that, and what broke that apart and then led to the rise of segregation? We have to also remember, before 1860, the vast majority of black Richmonders were enslaved. There was already a system of racial control that was in full force, and it was deemed sufficient. And remember, when we talk about capital and property, one of the greatest sources of Southern capital was other human beings. Other white people, we think of enslavement as being a labor system. It was an investment system. And in fact, we're going to be doing a show on the slave trade in October. We'll have a couple of community conversations about that coming up in the next few weeks. I hope you'll get a chance to come. We were the main exporter to the Deep South. So when you talk about people and capital accumulation and how wealth was created, think about that. Now, one other thing I want to mention, one thing I love about this map is you can see these kind of odd little ridge lines. It actually shows kind of the geography. You can see that there are, where the Shockoe Bottom area is, for instance, where the Shockoe Creek is still above ground. Yeah, if we go up a little bit, Sonia, I think we can probably... Yeah, so there's Shockoe Creek there, and that's the valley, the wall of the valley.
Where's this from? I mean, Greg.
Oops. Yeah. Let's see. Where do I put this? Right here. Okay. So here's the Shockoe Creek, and you can see this line right here is basically the outline of the valley. So one of the big distinctions in this period in terms of how people were segregated is poor people lived in the bottoms. Basically, Shockoe Creek was an open sewer. And it wasn't very pleasant to live in bottoms, generally speaking, in this period. And people who were of elite status lived, as they literally said, high, in places like Gamble's Hill, parts of Churchill, etc. So there was probably more, in a way, class segregation that was vertical than there was horizontal segregation. So how does that all change? Let's go to the map of the Beers Atlas of 1876. And again, we have to do a little bit more work on these maps to really interpret them because we don't have the data to necessarily do what we want to do. So if we look at this map, you see these yellow lines that are going through the map right here? Those are the new wards that were created in 1870. Anybody know 1870, why was that an important year? Reconstruction ended in Virginia. And what's happened is we've given the franchise to African American men who can now vote. And so all of a sudden the city decides that they're going to draw some new ward districts. So you've heard the term gerrymandering, I'm sure. So they create a ward, and it's called Jackson Ward, which is where the name of the neighborhood comes from. And this ward, I think it was also called the Shoestring Ward. It went through the traditional area of Jackson Ward, down through the Sharko Valley, and its only goal was to encompass as many black voters as possible, so that there would be only one of the 7 wards that would elect a city councilman who was an African American, which it did for a long time, into the 1890s. So if you can't control people one way, you switch the game and you do it another way. And that is one of the real takeaways from this map. It also starts to show you that, again, you start to see neighborhoods after the Civil War, after the end of slavery, that start to become predominantly either white or black. And that increases until, of course, is the official onset of Jim Crow law, where the distinction of neighborhoods is not just de jure. I'm sorry, it's not by practice, but it is actually de jure. It's by law. You also mentioned, when you were talking about the solidification of these neighborhoods, another technique that was used with the early streetcar suburbs in the 1880s, for instance, is you had restrictive covenants, right? You had a neighborhood association. They got to say who lived in that neighborhood. So once the streetcar comes in 1888, it's funny because Richmond loves that date. It's like one of our great dates. Hey, we had the first electric streetcar. Well, unfortunately, the electric streetcar became a lightning rod. It was, to some extent, the cause of this increasing racial segregation as whites moved out into the periphery and left poor people in the city center. The other thing is, of course, you had segregated streetcars, in which John Mitchell, the editor of the Richmond Planet, protested back in 1903 or 4. Unfortunately, he lost that fight in that period. So that's how, boy, that's a really probably inadequate and short explanation of how we go from this walking city that's very compact and to some degree racially integrated to what we know our neighborhoods to be. So, I want to get to questions as fast as I could. How are we doing on time there, Brian? 6:30? So we don't spend too much more time before we get to your thoughts. One thing we did decide that might be interesting to talk about, because we end with with me in the 19th century, and these immigrants, these German and Irish and British workers who are flowing into Richmond in 1850s, I thought it'd be interesting to talk a little bit about ethnicity today. How has it changed the dynamic of what we see in neighborhoods? And both of you, I'm sure, can address that question.
A couple of things. Number one, when I talked about this high-density poverty that was concentrated in East End Richmond and now South Side on both sides of the Jeff Davis Highway, north of the James River, it's racially identifiable, it's African American. South of the James River, however, it's largely Latino. The Latino community is really growing in Chesterfield County dramatically. And it's very much like black poverty with one difference. Both black poverty and Latino poverty is highly concentrated, but the difference is that black poverty still is concentrated primarily in the city, whereas most of the concentrated Latino poverty is concentrated in Chesterfield County. And so what we're seeing now is that Chesterfield County increasingly is looking more like the city, with a highly concentrated East End, and wealth is on the west side. So this east-west divide you find now in Chesterfield County, and you find it in Henrico County. One thing I'd like to mention in regard to ethnicity is that in Henrico County particularly, and specifically, I can give you the census tract. It's bordered by Patterson Avenue on the south, Parham on the east side, Gaskins on the west side, and Quioccasin on the north side. That is a census tract, and this is hard. When I first heard it, I was stunned. But I have a good friend who teaches ESL, English as a Second Language, at Tucker High School, which is right on Parham Road. And I was asking her one time, how many different languages are spoken at Tucker? The most I'd ever heard of any school in the past was something like between 30 and 33 different languages. 63 languages are now spoken at Tucker. It's amazing. People literally from all over the world, immigrants and refugees from Africa, the Middle East, Eastern Europe, the Americas, South Asia, Southeast Asia, all over the world. And I think most Richmonders are, unless they live close to these neighborhoods, are oblivious to the extent to which this metropolitan area is really becoming increasingly international. So it kind of goes back to the 19th century.
It does. I think it's an interesting parallel. I have played adult soccer in Richmond for a long time, and you know, we used to have Germans and Englishmen. We actually had this guy from Liberia, which was kind of interesting since it had such a Virginia root. But now the leagues are just exploding with, you know, you do see it becomes visible to you in that setting, but I think you're right about most Richmonders, it is not. Brian?
Right. We did a focus group with some Latino residents on the south side a few months ago, and you know, these are new immigrants to the area, and they're going into, there's a very clear kind of housing succession. And so new immigrants will come in and take up quarters in trailers. Now these trailers are divided up into 3 rooms, and a family will live in each room. So you have 3 families in a mobile home, in a trailer. And as they find work and save and learn the system that is the U.S., they'll advance to an apartment complex that's typically largely Hispanic, but overwhelmingly the American dream of single-family detached home ownership in the counties is still the goal. There's still this goal because they're looking at the same things that cause people to move out of the city all the time. Schools and crime and jobs, and they want the exact same things that all of us want. And so there was the census came out and said by 2024, I believe, that our population will be a majority minority population, meaning that there won't really be a majority, but that greater than 50% of the total population will be consisting of different minority groups. And so, you know, if you look at a whole number of variables, but if you look at lending, mortgage lending, and the amount of loan applications that minorities submit, and then denial rates, and their ability to achieve that dream of home ownership and move to the county, move wherever they want, it's so far out of line with what the white population experiences. So if we're looking at 2024 as this date, and we've got 10 years to figure out a system to integrate everybody and make it, you know, level the playing field so that everybody can achieve that dream.
Well, maybe that brings us to one final set of thoughts, and then we'll open it up. I know we talked about this question earlier this week about is Richmond just part of a pattern, of a larger American city pattern, or is it unique in some way as a southern city? And I guess adding to that, what policies could we use to try to move forward to a more equitable, not just housing situation, but obviously there's all kinds of other factors that flow into this.
If one were to take away the statues on Monument Avenue and just not open the history books there for a while, would Richmond be a southern city? I'm not sure it would be. It's very much like cities all across the United States. And that includes high concentration of poverty, greater distances separating wealth and poverty, the dynamics, economic, social dynamics, the dynamics having to do with pressures on local governments are no different, really, than what you find in any metropolitan area. In fact, Richmond is an interesting city to study because it is not too big and not too small. It's big enough to have all of the issues that you associate with major metropolitan areas such as New York, Boston, Chicago, LA, and on and on. By the same token, it's small enough that you can really kind of get your arms around the metropolitan area of Richmond. I like to call it a Goldilocks city, but it certainly is not that different from other. And your other question, Greg?
Well, let's stick with that one. I'll let Brian address that, and then we'll move on.
You wrote a book on this, right?
I did write a book on it. And I would say in the introduction period, the title says it all, American City, Southern Place. I mean, one thing is Richmond was the 25th largest industrial city in the United States, even though it had the 50th largest population, so it's always an industrial place. It always looked more like a Baltimore than it looked like Savannah or Charleston. So it always had that element. But at its heart, in that period, it also was this enormous slave, not only market, but in the state with the largest slave population. So in that sense, and this romanticization of their southernness, of elites, in that sense, they were very, there was at least a level of society that viewed themselves as being Southerners. Ergo, they decided to fight a fratricidal war, in 1861.
Yeah, I mean, I think overall, all cities generally have suffered the same. And Richmond's no different. I mean, the industrialization beginning in the late 40s, early 50s, when those inner city industrial jobs that paid a living wage and supplied the middle class started either moving to lower cost labor markets elsewhere in the country or overseas, and when industry started turning a profit by deunionizing and cutting workers, basically this whole inner city population had suddenly found themselves without jobs and without access to jobs that were springing up in the suburbs, because we don't have public transportation that goes beyond our city boundaries. A little bit, but not significantly. So, and I mean the history of Richmond itself. I mean, you've said it recently that Richmond really does embody America. I mean, the history of the country can be found and told in the history of Richmond.
I will say one thing in that particular case you're talking about that was a little different, I think, is that first of all, we made ourselves a right to work state, despite having a real labor history before that in the 1940s, okay? And I can remember interviewing a gentleman who lived on Churchill, who was one of the first black shop stewards at Philip Morris. He came in right at the moment when that happened, and when those jobs over a period of time started to go overseas. So right at the moment when when finally the unions were, which, you know, the AFL had a terrible reputation as for segregating people. Just as bad as any government ever did. And just at the moment when that broke down, all those other things happened and took that a power to earn away from them. So, you know, it would be a little different in a northern city if it was a strong union city. Although that same forces have come to pass even in those cities at this point. I agree with you generally, though, both of you, that these are the same forces we see across the board in urban areas. So, is anybody doing something better than we're doing here? And I particularly think about regionalism. I know that's something we talk about a lot. And is that a solution, or is it illusory? What are your thoughts?
I've spent a whole career talking about regionalism.
One more time.
One more time. It really is discouraging here in Central Virginia.
I'm with you.
And my concern is that the sense of localism associated with the counties is just getting stronger. One would think, for example, that the extent to which the counties demographically are looking more and more like the city, there would be more practical reason for the counties and the cities to work together, particularly Richmond, Chesterfield, and Enrico. But at this point, there is not.
That really does astound me to think, that you could not letting a bus run into Chesterfield County will somehow prevent poverty from existing. I mean, it's mind-boggling that people can think that way. And like you, I'm very frustrated. But I think it's probably time to let you have a say and ask us some questions. And I know there's people here that have some good ones. So Mark is going to give you a microphone if you would like to ask us something, and Adrian over here as well. Okay.
I'll kick it off. John, your theory about getting rid of Monument Avenue on Universal City, I have a test for that. Now, also you talked about the cultural pluralism that's on its way, and so my question is, I know of a cemetery which has lots of 19th century Irish and German people buried in it. So my question is, when the Latinos will be buried in Hollywood Cemetery?
Is there still space in
Oh
yeah,
Yes, there is space. Yes. One of you take that.
How much do the plots cost in Hollywood Cemetery? I don't know. Yeah, I don't know. We have a question right here, I think. Adrian? Oh, I'm sorry. Right here. Either one. You can pass it back and forth.
Okay, sure. My question, actually, we talked about the history of the nation being found in Richmond, and so I wanted to expand on that. Do you think that the future of the nation can be found in Richmond, in that the majority will be minority in one? So I think that there's evidence for that. And then the second thing is, we talked about inclusion and leveling the playing field because of that change in the color. So although the demographics are changing, the demographics of power are not changing. So you have Jim Crow's great grandchildren who are still in power, and what I call old money, who still have the reins. So even though you have the coloring of the city, you'll still have the same or a similar power structure. So how do you level the playing field and have more inclusion?
Yeah, I mean, that's a huge question, right? right? I mean, there are counties, there are jurisdictions in Virginia that have already become majority-minority jurisdictions, and some of these are in Northern Virginia where really the most vehement anti-immigration legislation was passed at the local level, really to keep anybody from gaining power. And that's really, I wish I in some ways had studied sociology, because a lot of this comes down to our personal biases and stigmas and how we deal with things that aren't like us. And certainly, I think history proves time and time again that people don't give up power freely. And that's really what this is that you have a changing of the population and the changing of dynamics. And we were talking about last night at this meeting about we got on the topic of the millennial generation and how things are so dynamic, and they're reinventing how things are done through the use of technology. And that's sort of almost, my feeling is that that's what we need to do with policy, is reinvent how things are done. Because it's just not going to continue to work the way it's been working.
One of the dynamics that is changing, though, that has changed in other places already, is that, traditionally, Richmond, it was a black-white dynamic. Let's face it; that was what was going on here. But now we're moving more towards what you would see in New York, right, where we have some large ethnic groups who may become players in that. And as a historian, I think about like in the 1850s, when the Nativist Party, the American Party, rose up. And just as an example, you have at the Tredegar Ironworks here in Richmond a group of foreign-born workers who actually build the works. These guys are ironworkers of the highest class. They are, you can't just train somebody to do this. You have to get people who know how to do it. Well, they go on strike in 1847 because the owner of Tredegar Ironworks decides to bring enslaved people into and have them trained as iron workers. And guess what the reaction is of these foreign-born workers? No way. You're taking my livelihood away, my son's livelihood away. Plus the racial dimension, which is pretty obvious. So the fear, my fear is that as it becomes increasingly diverse, it's pretty easy to play off different people against each other. And that is a time-honored tradition in American politics. So it's going to be complicated. More complicated than Richmond's used to, I think.
One thing I'm particularly interested in is how long it will, when we will begin to see the Latino community really organizing. I think that could, with the right kind of leadership, that is a community that really could exercise considerable influence. On the board, there are 5 magisterial districts in Chesterfield County, and again, because of that concentration in the eastern part of the county. And actually, something like that is needed to rectify there are all kinds of imbalances, for example, in Chesterfield County. Just take proffers. Anytime that a builder constructs a new home, they pay proffers, which is essentially a fee that goes to pay for water, sewage, the infrastructure, schools. Well, all of the new infrastructure, all of the new schools are in West End, but meanwhile in East Henrico County, what they're wanting to do is to provide affordable housing. Well, it's going to be very difficult to provide affordable housing as long as you have these proffers, unless the law could be changed, an ordinance could be changed such that you could direct proffers to improving schools, to rehabbing schools, to really developing stronger East End Richmond. And I think the only way that's likely to come about is for the Latino community to organize, and I think it's just a matter of time. Just as it was a matter of time for the African American community. The Crusade for Voters, organized in the 1950s, that's really when it started. Had to do with massive resistance. And so it'll be interesting, I think, to see if there's some political organizations that begin to take root with the intent of actually running people for public office in the Latino community in Chesterfield County. You're already seeing it in Henrico County with Tyrone Nelson being elected, second African American now on the Henrico board, along with a representative from the Fairfield district. But at this point, Chesterfield County's Board of Supervisors is all white. And it's just, it is not reflective of the population.
My question had to do with the regionalism and the role that Virginia governs that Dillon rule, and being the only one of the 50 states where you have independent cities and towns. How likely are we ever to do anything regionally with that law still hanging over our heads? And somehow, to me, seems to be the buffer that, you know, as long as I have this authority, I don't need to actually, you know, be a partner to anybody, you know, because the law says I can be independent. It's sort of like in economic development, every small town thinks they're going to get a king's dominion, and it's not going to happen, you know. So how do we, like the Chesterfield part, it was interesting, they used to have the bus to go down to John Tyler, and I bring this up often because I rode that bus, and they stopped it right around the time that Amazon came along. And that was to make sure that nobody from Richmond who didn't have could drive could get a job at Amazon. But if you work at Amazon, it's hard work. And so they're still struggling to find people to work there. And I found that interesting, but yet we don't have any transportation. And Chesterfield decided, well, we just don't have enough money for that route. But we still have enough money to go to the western part where most people don't need that, you know, bus route out near Commonwealth, you know, 20. So how can we sit by and still allow those decisions to be made without being challenged? And the, you know, the fallback is, well, we don't have any money for that.
Well, the first thing, and then I want my colleagues to chime in. What really is hurting, particularly the city of Richmond and other cities of the Commonwealth, is the General Assembly.
Right.
Who controls the General Assembly are the suburbs.
Right.
They have the General Assembly locked up. The cities just don't have the votes to, for example, enable cities, once again, to expand its boundaries. Richmond is landlocked, and I'm afraid it's going to be landlocked as long as I'm on this earth, and I am growing older, so, you know, maybe in a couple of 3 weeks, maybe, you know, the General Assembly will give way. But I don't see it happening. When you consider the growth of the suburbs in Northern Virginia alone, notwithstanding what's happening in Hampton Roads, they've got the votes, and they're not about to turn loose of that control and enable cities to annex some of their prized property if it's contiguous with the city. Now that's a real problem. I've heard people say, though I don't know what, but some have said that the only option left, really, for the cities would be the courts. That would be interesting. Federal courts. The problem is that now it appears there's no longer even any sentiment in the federal courts, and we're really talking about the highest court, for matters having to do with school segregation, matters having to do with segregation really across the board. It's sad how the Supreme Court has shifted so dramatically. One thing I will say, just a little factoid, but I've always found this interesting in terms of lack of regional transportation. In 1910, we, as you know, we had a very successful electric streetcar system. There was an interurban line, though, that connected Richmond to Ashland. In 1910, that engine was powered by 2 GE motors. And at full throttle, keep in mind, this is 1910, at full throttle, that train could go 90 miles an hour. That was over a century ago. Most commonly, the train traveled about 75 miles an hour. But a couple of engineers one time just were curious at full throttle, so they didn't allow any passengers on that train at the time, but they got it up to 90 miles an hour. If we had just kept our public transit system, instead of burning all of the streetcars and falling in love with the automobile, that's another one of our problems. But we had the infrastructure. We could have extended it so easily. It was already going into the suburbs, and then guess what? The city annexed the suburbs. The city grew larger and more powerful economically. But sadly, we did it to ourselves. We decided to go with the automobile, and then the suburbs, as they grew more populous, decided to do it to the cities and lock them in.
Have any thoughts on that, Brian?
No, there have been some pilot programs with federal planning grants that specifically ask for regional consortiums to even be able to apply for these planning grants. And that's one, that's kind of the top-down approach. Is just, there's greater connectivity, there's greater comprehension of how things interrelate at the regional level, and we have access to so much more information and so much more data, and are able to communicate so much more easily that it's out there, and I think it can be pushed along by tying federal dollars, federal investment in saying you don't get this money unless you are a regional consortia and you are doing projects in A, B, and C jurisdiction, and not just continuing to locate low-income housing tax credits or in the inner city, but tying it to making those programs work at a regional level, because all of it is regional. Just because you live in the city of Richmond doesn't mean you work there or buy your goods. You can't really buy a pair of shoes in the city of Richmond. There's no retail, but it's all regional, and we cross boundaries, and federal dollars probably should do the same thing.
Unfortunately, we have to wrap up right now, but we will have a little reception afterwards if you want to talk a little bit more about some of these issues. I want to definitely thank Sonia Coleman for putting together our website.
I didn't show how we can get to that website.
Oh, that's a great idea. Can you do that, Sonia?
Sure, and this is a new website using Omeka, which is an open source technology we've just started experimenting with. Right now, there's no great way to get here until I make one. So just type in this online, virginiamemory.com/online exhibitions, and you should see our mapping inequality exhibit here. See how quick this is. So as you see, we don't have many exhibits yet, but there it is, and that's on virginiamemory.com again. I'll share this link out through our Facebook and Twitter, so please look for it there. And we're going to continue working with these current and historical maps on some more exhibits, maybe some meat line projects coming up soon. So stay tuned.
Great, thank you. And I want to thank all of you for coming out tonight. Thank you very much. Give yourselves a big hand. Great. And thank these two kind gentlemen for coming in and visiting with us today.
Before we go out to the reception, just a little bit of housekeeping. You may see scattered throughout the auditorium some little index-sized cards with Library of Virginia logo on them. If you see one of those, please fill it out and leave it on the table towards the back of the lobby. It lets us know how you found out about us, what you liked, what you didn't like, and what you'd like to see in the future. So there's some pencils and pens out there if you didn't bring one with you. But if you see one, please let us know how you found out. Thank you.
Great, and one last advertisement. I do have the dates for the community conversations for the show on the Richmond slave trade. They are on Thursday, June 19th from 6 to 7, and Tuesday, June 24th, 12 to 1. And we do encourage people to come in and talk to us about the subject.
Can you repeat
and
that?
Obviously it's a hot topic right now in Richmond.
Can you repeat the dates?
Sure. The dates are June 19th, which is a Thursday, 6 to 7 p.m., and Tuesday, June 24th, and that's at noon. So we hope we'll see some of you for that conversation as well.
We do have flyers out in the lobby.
Oh, great. Mark's
We also have food out in the lobby.
Get your food. So let's go eat the food and talk some more. Thank you.